Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa and a member of the Finance Committee, joins us to talk about the stalled-out debt talks. Senator, this morning, or yesterday morning, actually, in Politico, there was an article with the headline, GOP strategy on debt talks not on the level. It says the president on Wednesday lashed out at Republican congressional leaders for stalling during negotiations over long-term deficit reduction and avoiding hard but obvious choices about raising federal revenues. Your response to that, sir?
Well, I find the president very easy to get along with when there's a lot of pageantry that goes along with bipartisanship. But when it comes to the hard work of bipartisanship, I don't see him sitting down with people that really get the work done. And, you know, he's flying all over the country and making speeches all over and starting his campaign already. If he'd put as much time into helping get a bipartisan agreement on debt reduction and on everything else that's connected with the economy, I think the time would be better spent. So I accept what he wants to do. But it would be better if he had been at the table maybe 2 months ago instead of having Biden at the table.
Yesterday in the president's news conference, he talked about tax deductions for wealthy Americans must be on the table. We're going to take a look at that and then get Senator Grassley's response.
Sure.
I want to be clear about what we're proposing here. I spent the last 2 years cutting taxes for ordinary Americans. And I want to extend those middle-class tax cuts. The tax cuts I'm proposing, we get rid of, are tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires, tax breaks for oil companies and hedge fund managers and corporate jet owners.
Senator Grassley?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would suggest that he ought to read Professor Vedder of Ohio, who studied raising taxes and what does it do to the budget. And he studied it since World War II, and Professor Vedder has said that when Congress raises taxes $1, it's a license to spend $1.17. So I look at what Professor Vedder says, and I think, well, if Chuck Grassley votes to increase taxes by $1, it's making the deficit worse instead of better. Because, see, we have an overspending problem here in Washington. We don't have a problem that anybody's under tax, and I say that with great sincerity because for 50 years, the average tax coming into the federal government was 18.2% of gross national product. And spending during that period of time was about 19 or 20%. Now you got spending up to 25%. And it's that difference, or the desire to have government consume so much more, that is the problem today. For instance, you know, over the last 2 years, we increased expenditures 22%. And that's on top of the $814 billion deficit that didn't keep unemployment under 8% like the president said it would. And you just can't increase expenditures 22% when you only have a 2% growth in the economy. So, you know, it's the spending side of the ledger that's a problem. Now, I'm not going to argue with the president that certain loopholes ought to be closed. But when you look at corporate loopholes, it ought to be done in the context of reform of corporate taxation. Because you had a previous caller, as I listened here, who said that we're the second highest. Now we might be the highest corporate tax in the entire world. So yeah, we ought to reduce the corporate tax. We ought to close loopholes, but it ought to be done in the context of corporate tax reform because of the globalization of the economy. And also the same thing on income tax. We've got an atrocious tax code, and those of us in the Finance Committee have even made it somewhat worse and more complicated. We ought to throw it out and start over again and do tax policy as tax policy, but not do what the president said, do some taxes now so we can spend more, because the problem is not under taxation, the problem's overspending.
We're talking with Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa and member of the Finance Committee. We'd like to get you involved in the conversation. The numbers are on the screen, 624-1115 for Republicans, Democrats 202-624-1111, and Independents 202-624-0760. You can also send us messages via email and Twitter. Our first call for Senator Grassley comes from Morehead City, North Carolina. Georgia on our line for Democrats. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Go ahead, Georgia.
Okay, I'm on the line.
Yes, ma'am.
I would like to say that the mess that we're in right now is being blamed on President Obama when we had all those years of President Bush and Clinton messing up the budget, and President Obama's getting blamed for it. He gets blamed for everything. But what I want to say is I thoroughly agree with taxing the rich people, and I've thought that for years. And I am on Social Security, and if you attack Social Security and Medicare, I have a feeling nobody needs to run for dog catcher even if they run again.
All right, Georgia, before I let you go, what is your definition of rich?
Rich? Millions.
All right, millionaires. Senator Grassley.
You know what? I'll agree with the caller, but I want to add to something she said. I agree with the caller that President Obama inherited a terrible mess from the previous administration. But it doesn't matter whether you look at unemployment or the budget deficit or, the price of gasoline. All of these things have gotten tremendously worse under President Obama. So no doubt, she's right. It wasn't good when he took office, but there isn't a statistic that you might point out that President Bush, where he was on things, it's worse now. Very much worse.
Our next call comes from Cal in Cookeville, Tennessee, on our line for Republicans. Go ahead, Cal.
Thank you very much for taking my call. Senator Grassley, I really do appreciate you. I've watched you all the time, and I think you have very good common sense. When I believe in like this, very simple like that, we're not going to get ourselves out of this thing until everybody pays their fair share. We have 40% of the American people today don't pay a dime in taxes. I propose that we have a 3% sales tax for 10 years. And along with that, though, a stipulation that for every $1 we collect, $4 we have also like that in a budget cut. So we cut things down, too, as well. That's what I think would help us tremendously, that part, too. But you cannot have just 60% of the American people like to pay all the bills. It's not going to work. You have to bring some revenues in, but at the same time, you have to cut your spending. In my situation, I was a businessman like that, and my business went under. I went from $130,000 a year down to $30,000 a year. I had to do things I didn't want to do. I tightened my belt real strongly, and I'm starting to come back.
Cal in Cookeville, Tennessee. Senator Grassley?
Well, I don't. He's got a sensible approach if raising taxes would go to the bottom line. But I think maybe he didn't hear me, but I refer to Professor Vedder again. Dollars worth of taxes coming in doesn't go to the bottom line. It's a license to spend $1.17. We've had taxes coming into this country for about 50 years, 18.2% of gross national product. I say that that's a level of taxation you don't have revolt against. It hasn't harmed the economy. So history kind of proves that that's a fair amount for the federal government to take, leave the 82% in your pocket to spend. And then get we can't go up from 20% up to 25% of gross national product like we have in the last 2 years, the level of expenditure. We've got to bring that level of expenditure back to where it was for historical average of about 19 to 20%. So that's why I keep saying Congress is overspending, and you can't have this 22% increase. So one of the things that I would do to help solve this situation, I would preempt that 22% increase, go back to the 2008 level of expenditure, and I would freeze it for 5 years. And then that's just on discretionary. That's only 15% of the budget. If you really want to solve the deficit problem, you've got to look at entitlements. That's 45% of the budget. We've got to save Social Security. We've got to save Medicare. But the trustees give an annual report. And down the road, we know that those programs are going to go under if we don't do something. Or I can say Medicare is going to go under. Social Security is not really going to go under, but instead of paying 100% of benefits, by 2036, we're going to pay 75% of benefits, because at that point, that's what the cash flow what's coming in, you can't pay any more than going out after you use up the assets. Between 2017 and 2036, we use up the assets, the interest on the assets, but after that. So I don't want somebody that's drawing Social Security say to me today, just leave Social Security alone and it'll take care of itself. It won't take care of itself at 100% of benefits. If you're satisfied with 75% of benefits, then we can leave it alone. But I think I have a responsibility to make sure that my grandchildren have the same Social Security I have, and that my grandchildren have the same Medicare that I would have if I were in retirement.
Our next call comes from Robert in Hermitage, Tennessee, on our line for independence. Good morning, Robert.
Good morning, sir. Senator Grassley, I really respect you. I've watched you for years. I think you're a very intelligent guy. And I'm going to tell you something a little shocking. The guy that's coming on after you, Bernie Sanders, I also agree with him. A couple of things that you could do, I think, to change this budget talk entirely. Is a means testing for Social Security. And I'm disabled and draw disability benefits, so I understand this a little bit more than the average bear. But a person that's drawing or has a net worth of $5 million, as an example, or more, that draws a Social Security check, that should be eliminated. Warren Buffett made that point 18 months ago, and everybody poo-pooed it and said it's a bad idea. Two, Donald Trump mentioned something that I thought was kind of interesting when he was playing around with running for president, and said, why are we spending billions and billions of dollars for bases in South Korea, in Japan, and the Philippines, and around the world in bases that does not need to be open? Now, if you want to pull those people out of there, discharge them from the Army if they want to be out. Otherwise, they can be doing work other than what they're doing there, and it costs. You and I both know it costs billions and billions of dollars to keep each one of these bases open. And in addition to that, once you start that line of thinking, and if the South Koreans want protection, fine. They're making our products. They can pay for the protection.
Robert, we're going to leave it there. You've given us a lot to work with.
I would agree with him. We have too many bases overseas, but I would not agree with him where we have treaty obligations. We're going to have to maintain those treaty obligations, like with NATO or with South Korea. Or else you got to go through the process of getting out of the treaties, and then to what extent do you lose your credibility if you try to do that? You're going to have Bernie Sanders on. There's one thing Bernie Sanders and I really agree on, and we work together on. We don't work together on much, but we agree that the Federal Reserve should be audited. The Federal Reserve is part of our government. It should not have it ought to have more transparency. And with transparency comes accountability. You got the government's right to know. I would say one last thing for the person about means testing. We probably will have to means test Social Security more. I want to emphasize the word more, because maybe the caller doesn't realize that Social Security is mean tested indirectly now through higher income people putting in 85% of their Social Security to be taxed a second time. That's a mean testing, because that money goes in the Social Security Trust Fund. And then the other way it's mean tested, if you're higher income, you probably get about 22% of what your last paycheck was, as opposed to lower income people getting, I think, about 44 or 45% of what their last paycheck before they retired was. See, so two ways it's already means tested.
Well, now, we've got a tweet here from American Hero regarding means testing, and he says the problem with, quote, means testing Social Security is it rewards the profligate and punishes the prudent.
Yeah. Well, we've got a lot of policy that's in that area already, so I agree with him. But we've kind of adopted the policy throughout 200 years of our history that one way or another, people that are destitute, people that can't help themselves, people that need a little push to get along, hopefully to lift them into self-sufficiency, there's always been some sort of government program to do that, whether it was during the Revolutionary War and the houses of poverty, or whether it was now with what we call TANF, or welfare, you know. But what I resent is, and you get back into what the president's kind of talking about, taxing higher income people to a greater extent. You can have a situation, let's take the estate tax as an example. I'm an advocate for doing away with the estate tax, because you can have two people that have made $1 million each all of their life. Somebody's very conservative, he puts it away so his children and grandchildren can have something. This other person drank it up, gambled it away, everything else. They make the same amount of money throughout their lifetime, but somehow this person doesn't have anything to leave to his kids. This one does. So you've got that sort of unequal treatment. But there's no way that the tax code can recognize what the gentleman, the common sense email that you got indicates. So I guess we have to live with it.
In the New York Times earlier this week, they had an editorial that says debt limit dog days to succeed. Serious negotiations require a serious negotiator. They write that ending unnecessary subsidies for oil companies would raise $40 billion over 10 years, while a tax accounting change that would also apply mainly to oil companies could raise $72 billion over 5 years. Getting rid of a tax break for corporate jets would raise about $3 billion. Closing a loophole that allows private equity money managers to pay tax at about the lowest rate in the tax code would raise $20 billion over 10 years. They say the fixation on the deficit has drawn attention away from the far more urgent problem of employment. Deficit reduction, done right, requires enactment of a plan for spending cuts and tax increases that can be implemented as the economy recovers. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, I get back to some things I've already said, but I think they're very basic. There's nothing wrong with the article, the suggestion of where you can get more money, but you ought to consider tax policy as tax policy. So those corporate and oil company subsidies, tax policies ought to be considered one of two ways. Either when you're revising corporate tax policy, or in the case of oil companies, I'd say it'd be better to do it when you got energy policy, because we have four things we have to do for energy independence. One, drill here and drill now, and encourage production of oil. You got to have alternative energy. You have to have nuclear energy, and you have to have conservation. All of those have some subsidies. We ought to consider those subsidies within energy policy, so that you have a level playing field for all the things you want to accomplish in energy to be more independent. And that's another thing we could do to create jobs in this country. Instead of spending $835 billion, no, I said it wrong. Instead of spending $835 million every day to import oil, there's no reason that we shouldn't be drilling here and drilling now, using all of our sources of oil, all of our sources of alternative energy, and we need a level playing field for all those different sources. If there's no subsidies, that's a level playing field. If there are subsidies, then the subsidies ought to be somewhat equal.
We're talking about the stalled out debt talks this morning with Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa. Our next call comes from Kansas City, Missouri. Nancy on our line for Republicans. Go ahead.
Yes, Senator Grassley, I believe that we should go back to the balanced budget amendment we had during the Reagan era. Also, I would like to make a couple comments. I believe that Social Security, yes, needs to be revised, and it also needs, I'm a baby boomer, and I would like to see Social Security revised so that it is there for everyone in the future. Also, my brother is a businessman, a small businessman, and he's not be able to get loans because of all the requirements that the banks have to loan money, and I'd like to see that changed also. Thank you. I'll wait for your comment.
Yeah. I think I can answer all of her questions except small business. And there you got a situation where banks, as well as small business, they don't know what the future holds. You know, there's this health care reform bill that's got to be implemented. There's a question of taxes going to go real high at the end of 2012. There's all this regulation writing that's going on in this administration. All this leads to one word: uncertainty. And if we could have more certainty of what the future is, in other words, let's stop writing regulations. Let's tell people we aren't going to increase taxes at the end of 2012. That we're going to drill here and drill now and have cheaper energy. All those things would loosen up the banks, loosen up the corporations that have trillions that are in reserve, that they'd like to hire people, but they aren't going to hire anybody when they don't know what government's going to jab them in the rear end tomorrow, you know. So they're being very cautious. And if we could get people being less cautious, and that would come from more predictability of what the government's going to do or not do, and government not do these bad things as shutting down the economy, then I think we'd have small business lending by the banks, and small business would spend, the corporations would spend. Social Security, I've already talked about it, so the last thing for Nancy would be the balanced budget amendment, and she's right. About 20 years ago, less than that, it was up for a vote, came up one vote short, and I'm ashamed to say that was the one Republican that didn't vote for it made a difference. Otherwise, we would have a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution right now like 46 of the 50 states do, and it would be a good discipline. It's going to come up on July the 18th for a week-long debate, and all 47 Republicans are signed up for it. It's our hope that we'll have at least 20 Democrats that would vote for it, and if we do, then it'll be well on its road to having the same requirement as the states have, and it would be a good discipline to make sure it isn't going to help with the immediate problems we have right now. That's got to be cut right now to get the immediate. But when we get out of this hole, the balanced budget amendment requirement would help us stay more fiscally sound.
Our next call for Senator Grassley comes from Baltimore, Maryland. On our line for Democrats, Robert, you're on the Washington Journal.
It's Roberta, and I'm glad to be on. Senator Grassley, I appreciate you. 2 questions, sir. 3 questions. First, do all the big farmers owned by Japan, the big farms owned by Japan and China, are they going to get the farm taxes? Another thing, why couldn't we do as your President Reagan did and start the program, the CETA program, to get the roads fixed here? Teach kids and other people how to work, what to do when they go to work. We had it during the CETA program, our roads got a lot better. Did you know, sir, that General Electric paid no taxes? All these companies that you're standing for paid no taxes. They got 40 lawyers making sure about the taxes, the lawyers and the CPAs. And they've done nothing with the lower taxes that Bush had recommended. Let the people with the big money pitch in too.
Roberta, we're going to leave it there.
See, I didn't understand what she was talking about, the farm taxes.
Well, let me...
Did you know what she was talking about?
I think so. Let me talk to you a little bit about a editorial that was in USA Today about 10 terrible tax breaks. Number 2 was what they call the corn-based bunk. They write that ethanol, the fuel made from corn, does not even come close to competing with traditional gasoline on price. So taxpayers give farming business up to 45 cents per gallon in subsidies. The making of the fuel takes valuable farmland out of food production, raising supermarket prices for meat and grains, while consuming vast amounts of tractor fuel and fertilizer. The cost is $5.7 billion. And then add to that, if you will, a question from Fran Gadici in Oswego, New York. She says, how about explaining why the farm subsidy program makes sense?
Well, in regard to the ethanol, well, let's start with the second one. two reasons, I think, for farm subsidy programs. And I'm talking about, I'm an advocate that we shouldn't be paying big farmers to get bigger. And I've always been a sponsor of what you call a hard cap. I think that it's silly for some farmers to get millions of dollars from the farm program. 10% of the biggest farmers get 70% of the farm program. Now, I want to be honest, or intellectually honest with you here. I'm a farmer. I get some benefit from the farm program. But 10% of the biggest farmers get 70% of the benefits from the farm program. The farm program needs to be targeted towards small and medium-sized farmers. And we need a hard cap. But it's difficult. It's in the Midwest, it's easy to get support for that. But in South and the West, it's difficult to get support for it. So I haven't been successful, but I'm going to try again. But anyway, two reasons. One, the old saying that we're only 9 meals away from a revolution. For social cohesion, social stability, you don't want food riots like they have in some countries. And so protecting the family farmer, and I'm not talking about the mega farmer, I'm talking about the family farmer. It's the most efficient way to produce food. You want to make sure that when you have natural disasters, or you have, look at the politics that affects farm prices. When Carter puts a grain embargo on, or let's say Ford puts a grain embargo on, prices go down. Or let's say a natural disaster, when lock and dam goes out on the Mississippi River, and you can't use the Mississippi River to get your grain out for export, and the price drops 25 cents in one day. That's not the farmer's fault. And so a safety net is to protect a farmer against things that are beyond his control, because he doesn't control the weather. He doesn't control Washington. He doesn't control international politics. He doesn't control whether there's war, To have something happen in Israel this morning, it's going to affect farm prices. So that's one reason. The second one is for national security, because, you ask the Germans or the Japanese, why do they protect their farmers? Because they found out that when you starve during World War II, you can't efficiently run your national defense. So for national defense and social cohesion is why you have a farm program. Now that's the second question. The first one on ethanol, remember only 3% of the coarse grain worldwide goes into biofuels. So anybody that says that we're taking food out of the mouths of people because we make ethanol out of it, and 10% of all the fuel burned in cars is from ethanol, and that's equal to what we import from Venezuela or from Saudi Arabia. Now, do people in this country think we ought to do away with the 10% that comes from renewable fuels, domestically produced fuels, and then rely more on people like Chavez that hates us, or send more money to Saudi Arabia so they train terrorists to kill us? I don't think that's very good national policy. It's not very good energy policy. We ought to be praising people that want to produce domestically produced energy. And if you wonder whether or not you ought to have help for ethanol, which is going to end right now, at the end of this year it's going to end, all you got to ask is, would you want to import more oil and raise that $835 million every day we send overseas? No, I think we want domestically produced renewable fuel. And we wouldn't have a biofuels industry if there hadn't been some help from the government to get it started. But now it's a mature industry. It ought to be done away with.
We've got Tom on the line from Baltimore, Maryland also. Tom on our line for Republicans. Go ahead, Tom.
How you doing? I'd like to thank Grassley for being on your show. I'm a strong supporter of the Republican Party, have been for over 30 years. And what I'd like to get at you, I noticed all this fighting that's going on in the House. I want to know why the Republicans. Now, I'm a strong supporter of the Republicans, but it seems to me like they've changed their menu or something. In other words, they don't want to compromise, and they're turning around, they're fighting on this oil tax. And it doesn't make sense to me when here you have oil companies that's making all these billions of dollars, and then they're going to try to take it out on the poorer person. Now, what gets me is on this, they go after our Medicare and our Medicaid, and then all you hear Boehner on the floor saying, well, this is what the people want. And it's not what the people want. It sounds to me like it's what the big businesses want. Now, me, I'm a strong supporter of the Republican Party, but I'm seriously thinking of switching over to the Democrats. And that's really, about all I have to say for right now. Do I have any comments on it?
Well, if you're going to change tax policy for corporations, do it in the context of revising the second highest corporate tax rate in the world so we can be more competitive with our international competition. Don't do it in the context of raising more money so Congress can spend more. And he talked about Medicare. Republicans want to save Medicare. It's part of the social fabric of America. It's not just a government program. It is a government program. But you got to remember, when people retire from John Deere's in Iowa, if they retire after 30 years, they get health care from the age 55 to 65 paid for by the corporation. But after they become 65, Medicare is dovetailed in with their corporate health retirement plan, and their John Deere plan becomes a supplement to Medicare. So it isn't only to save it because it's a government program, it's part of the social fabric of America. Republicans want to save it, but the fact is that if we do nothing, like a lot of people are saying, well, just don't touch Medicare, we know by 2021, based upon what the trustees say, not what I say, there isn't going to be any Medicare hospitalization program. The trust fund's going to be broke. So if you don't want to do something in Medicare, it's like saying 2021, we aren't going to have any. So you got to do something, see.
While we're on the subject of Medicare, your thoughts about the Medicare proposal that was put forward by your colleagues, Senators Lieberman and Coburn, earlier this week?
Well, news people like you asked me about that earlier this week, and I said I'm welcome any ideas to be put on the table, but I think I want to see it in the context of an environment that can get it passed. Because I worked on Social Security reform in 2005. President Bush ran on it, change it. I worked within the Republican Party to try to put together a plan, but unless you bring Democrats to the table, nothing gets done, and they sat it out. So the same way, you got a Republican and a Democrat presents this plan. I'm proud of them for doing it. But if they don't get the president to the table, you could be spinning your wheels. So I want to make sure we got an environment that can do it. Congress could pass it, but if the president vetoes it, what good does it do? You want a product. When you're working on something that's part of the social fabric of America, it ought to be done in a bipartisan way, just like Social Security and Medicare and civil rights legislation and a lot of other social programs were passed with broad bipartisan support. The only social program that I ever know that's been passed on a partisan basis is the health care reform bill of President Obama. And look at what that's done. 38% of the people support it. About 45% of the people say it ought to be thrown out. If it had been worked through on a bipartisan way, you probably wouldn't have that opposition to it now and possible repeal of it.
Back to the phones, our conversation with Senator Chuck Grassley, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Steve on our line for independence. You're on the Washington Journal.
Thanks for taking my call. Senator Grassley, thanks so much for sharing your time and thoughts with C-SPAN viewers all over the world. I have a point and a suggestion. First point, you are so right in pointing out that if Congress does not do anything, does not take one vote, we will have a massive tax increase starting in 18 months. And that's because the Bush tax regime goes away and we return to the Clinton tax regime. Now, the last time I looked, President Clinton was a Democrat. And so what's really going on now is that the Democrats are rejecting President Clinton's form of tax because our current law is scheduled for a massive tax increase. And so the real message the Democrats are giving is that while there's a tax increase coming, we don't like what that tax increase is. We reject what President Clinton's tax regime was, and we essentially simply want to tax the rich. That was point number one. My suggestion is that I'm a tax lawyer, and I've come up with a 12-point plan for reforming the Internal Revenue Code, both individual tax, corporate tax, and estate tax. And I commend it to your committee's reading. It's the nickel, dime, quarter tax. You can find it at www.nickel-dime-quarter-tax. And it reduces rates to 5, 10, and 25%. Gets rid of all the deductions like the Commission did, the Revenue Commission did back in December. It returns a lot of revenue streams back onto the tax rolls. It eliminates the payroll tax. It eliminates the capital gains tax. We'll have no more AMT tax, and we'll end deferral of foreign earnings in exchange for lowering the corporate tax rates 25%.
Steve in Minneapolis, giving us a lot to work with. Senator Grassley.
Well, I think I've spoken about my willingness to throw out the corporate tax, broaden the tax base, reduce the marginal tax rate, or better yet, set up a territorial system of taxation, because our corporate tax system in this country is the only one in the world. Everybody else taxes corporate income where it's earned. We tax it when it comes home. And we'd be better, probably more competitive, if we had a system like the rest of the world has. And on the income tax, it sounds to me like he's going back to similar to what we had in the 1986 tax bill. And I think that that broadening of the tax base, reducing marginal tax rates, is going to be better for the economy. Because right now, we have so many complicated tax codes. Every tax policy is a political decision that money ought to be invested here or spent here or help out people in need there. And so it's a political decision. The more money, the less restriction we have in Washington on how you spend your money and how much tax you pay, and let the marketplace make the decision as opposed to politicians making, it'll cause the economy to grow much faster. And that's what we have to do. We haven't talked about it at this meeting, but we talked about raising taxes or not raising taxes. But the only way we're going to get out of the situation we're in with more revenue is to grow the economy. And by the way, the present tax policy we have right now, that this gentleman said will end December 31st, 2012, and then get the biggest tax increase in the history of the country, that CBO, Congressional Budget Office, says that we'll get above this 18.2% 50-year average I've talked about. It'll go up to 19% at the end of 10 years without even increasing taxes. So the president is on television yesterday saying we need to increase taxes. The present tax laws is going to bring in more revenue.
He also mentioned the AMT, and roll call had on Wednesday on the front page, is AMT fix a debt solution? Senate Budget Chairman Kent Conrad said this week he believes Republicans could be enticed to vote for controversial revenue raisers if Democrats promise to provide permanent relief from the alternative minimum tax, which for years has bedeviled both parties as they watch the tax intended for the wealthy threaten middle-income Americans.
Well, if it's revenue neutral, doesn't raise taxes, that's one thing. But there's some people in this town that aren't in Congress who says you can't change any tax law, even if it doesn't bring in new revenue, because you're reducing it over here and raising it over here. We got 137 million taxpayers, and I don't know how you pass a law in Congress or have the president sign it and know exactly how it's going to affect 137 million taxpayers. There's no way you can do that.
Our next call for Senator Grassley comes from Camden, Connecticut. Dee on our line for Democrats. Go ahead, Dee.
Hi, good morning, gentlemen. Hi, Mr. Grassley. I'm glad you took my call. I have one comment and a couple of questions. I hope you can answer them as honestly as possible.
Sure.
My comment is, are you as disgusted with the human race being so selfish to one another? Instead of helping each other, everybody seems to want to take instead of give to help each other. That's my comment. But my question is, the debt ceiling, don't you think we need to pay these bills that we so graciously took from these people? We need to give them back their money. If we was able to take the money and spend it on whatever it is we needed to spend it on, we should pay it back. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about that. We need to pay that money back because we took it. We used it. We need to pay it back. My next question is, why are the Republicans so hell-bent on making Obama fail? Don't you realize that if he fails, we fail?
Dee, we're going to leave it there. We're running out of time. Senator Grassley?
Nobody wants Obama to fail, because if Obama fails, the country fails. But there is differences of policy, and you can have honest, for the Connecticut caller, I can say you can have honest differences of disagreement on policy and still not want Obama to fail or the country to fail. Yes, we got to pay back our debt. And lastly, about whether we're selfish or not, Americans give more to nonprofit organizations and charity than any other country in the world. So I think it's something we can be proud of. And from the standpoint of charitable giving, we're not selfish people.
Our last call for Senator Grassley comes from Marietta, California. Howard on our line for Republicans. Go ahead.
Well, good morning, Rob. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
You've done a fine job, and I support you 100%. I'm very happy to hear your reaction to the ethanol conversation, and I don't quite understand all the details. I do know that it's no longer going to be subsidized, as I understand it, and you know, those corn farmers work like hell, whether they're selling their corn on the open market or they're selling it to the ethanol people for the biofuel. I think that due to the situation in the world economy today, that the corn price of a bushel of wheat, a bushel of corn is going to hold. You've answered a lot of questions. Would you just quickly touch, and this is not exactly, Rob, if you could just give me a second. We haven't really talked about it, but I'd like you to talk about it, Senator, the stacking of the NLRB, the Boeing situation, and how you look at what's going on. When I say the stacking of NLRB with people that are really pro-union, that maybe a little explanation from you, Senator, this morning, put a little light on what labor is doing.
Howard, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry.
I think that the NLRB is making a power grab. I think all of their actions are ultra vires. I believe that they're trying to do by regulation or by administrative action what they can't get through the Congress of the United States. And it's stretching all of the labor laws way beyond anything Congress intended, even in 1938 when it was passed.
Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, has been our guest. Thank you very much for being on the program, sir.
Thank you. Glad to be with you, of course.